We now want to welcome on to Forever Blue Shirts, the former flow champion of the New York Rangers B team, Vince Mercogliano. Vince, how are we doing today?
I cannot take that title. That has to belong to Mika Zibanejad.
I would say you were rivaling him at some point, right? I mean, it seemed like it was a competition.
I might have had a little length on him at some point, but he's holding strong with it. Him and I have joked about it a few times. I don't plan to get rid of it anytime soon. He's pretty attached to it, and he's got some really, really good flow. So I'm happy to defer the title to him for now.
If it works with Artemi Panarin, he might want to think about maybe cutting his hair at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Panarin's hair has definitely been a story, or lack of hair has definitely been a story so far in this camp.
All right, well, another big story from camp and obviously throughout the entire offseason was Alexi Lafreniere, and the fact that over the last couple of months has been well documented that, he needs to take this step forward this year, and it's a big year for him in his development. Have you seen anything from him in camp to signal that he's taking that step forward?
Well, I think tonight is going to be a really big night for him because he's getting a chance to play in a preseason game. It's his second preseason game, but this is his first game on what looks like it is at least the direction that Peter Laviolette is leaning in terms of the top line. So it's going to be Chris Kreider at left wing, Mika Zibanejad at center, and Alexi Lafreniere at right wing. And Lafreniere has exclusively played right wing through the first week or so of this camp. Laviolette told us in the preseason that that's what he wanted to do, and we've seen him executing that plan to this point. We actually just had a conversation with Laviolette about it about an hour ago before I came on with you, and he was saying that he's been really encouraged by the way that Lafreniere has adapted to that position, said he's been really responsive. Sounds like they've had a lot of open dialogue and looked at some video together and really tried to talk through maybe some of the growing pains there. He seems pretty confident that Lafreniere can do it. Lafreniere has told us repeatedly over the years that he's open to doing it. And as the coach pointed out today, if it means playing in the top six, more specifically, what we're seeing is playing on the top line, I certainly don't think you're going to hear any complaints from Lafreniere. So I think this preseason game against the Devils on Thursday night is a pretty big one for him, because I think if that line has a good showing, they have a really strong chance of going into the season as the top line. And obviously, if Alexi Lafreniere is going to be a top line player, playing alongside guys of that caliber, you have to really like his chances for an increase in production this season.
I know a big issue with Lafreniere, it revolves around his skating. Have you seen anything that would, again, regard him improving in that area?
He did say that that was his main focus this offseason. I believe he said that last year as well. It's no secret. He knows that to play at this level means you need to play at a faster speed. And I think the knock on him, especially in talking to scouts the last couple of years since we've had a chance to watch him at the NHL level, is that he hasn't been able to consistently create enough separation to let that skill and that playmaking that made him into the number one overall pick back in 2020 really shine. So is he ever going to be a burner? I don't think so. I mean, you can work on your skating, but I don't know if you can go to like from average to elite. But if he can go a little more toward above average, I think that would be a good thing for the Rangers. Everybody, people have been asking me this question so far in camp. To me, everybody looks quicker at this time of year because they're fresh. They're not banged up. They had a whole summer to rest and work out. They're all coming here for the most part in top shape. So obviously you're going to see a little more jump in their step. I also think that these practices under Peter Laviolette have been more fast-paced than what we're used to seeing. So yeah, I guess I would say he does look like he's a little bit faster, but everybody kind of looks a little bit faster this year. So I'm not going to go make any big proclamation that he's increased his skating time. I haven't seen specific times yet, but he does look like he's playing with a little jump in his step, as many of the guys are right now.
I believe it was the Carolina Hurricanes that said it perfectly on Wednesday. The preseason only counts if you win. It doesn't count if you lose. Just how much investment do you have in these games for regulars if they have a good or bad preseason?
Not a whole lot, to be honest with you. I'm more looking at the guys that you feel like still have something to prove. And there are some regular guys that definitely have something to prove. But I think these games are really important in the sense of especially for the Rangers where they're at right now. There's not a whole lot of roster competition. I've said this repeatedly now. I think 21 of the 22 spots on the roster are pretty much set. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a competition for who that 13th forward is going to be. Johnny Brodzinski, Alex Belzile, Riley Nash. I think those are the names in the mix there. But what I'm really watching for is the lineup combinations, because Laviolette has been open about wanting to experiment and look at different things. And he has been true to his word there as well. We've seen a lot of different combinations. For example, the first day of practice kind of opened everybody's eyes wide to see the D pairs that we're used to seeing split up, where you had Adam Fox playing with Keandre Miller and Jacob Trouba with Ryan Lindgren. Well, then the next 4 or 5 days after that, they went back to the usual pairs, Fox, Lindgren, Miller, Trouba. But now tonight on Thursday against the Devils, it looks like we're going to see Fox and Miller again. So for me, like seeing them try out different things like that, seeing if they might find something in the preseason that will then stick for the regular season, that's where I'm interested. And that's kind of what I'm watching closely. I think it's really interesting for the forward combinations right now. The top line, it looks to me like he's really leaning toward Kreider, Zibanejad, and Lafreniere. And I think the fourth line, we've seen a pretty good indication of what Laviolette wants to do there. And he really liked the game the other night that Barclay Goodrow, Nick Bonino, and Tyler Pitlick had together. I think the questions are in that middle six range. What's the second line going to look like? What's the third line going to look like? Will Philip Hedl, who's out right now, going to miss a few days, but it sounds like it won't be very long before he's back. Will he get a chance to play on that second line with Artemi Panarin? That's something I'm really intrigued about. Where does Capo Caco fit in? Where does Blake Wheeler fit in? So these are sort of the questions that I have on my mind going into these preseason games, more so than the results of the games. And of course, I'm interested in watching the young guys. Will Cooley, I think right now is really making a good impression on Peter Laviolette because he continues to give him pretty prime opportunities. I'm convinced that among the prospects, he might not be the highest ranked, but he's the guy that they think is closest to being NHL ready and should get an opportunity, maybe not right out of camp, but I think at some point this season. Obviously, Brennan Othmann is a guy I'm watching closely. So guys like that, Zach Jones, Matthew Robertson, some of these young guys who you're curious about their development. Those are sort of the long list of things that I think I'm watching for in these preseason games.
Well, when you talk about line shuffling, I know over the last 2 years, a lot of was made about Gerard Gallant maybe trying to shuffle lines and immediately going back to what was already put in place. Do you feel like Laviolette could do that during the regular season? Obviously, shifting lines during the preseason is one thing, but do you feel like in the regular season, once we get there, it's more these are your lines, or that there will be some experiments?
To be determined. I would not be surprised at all if early in the season you see a variety of different combinations, but I did sense from being in the locker room every day last season, there was an underbelly of frustration with the players about how frequently the lines were being changed. You'd hear guys make comments like, oh, well, you never know. It's probably going to look different tomorrow. And I heard from a couple guys who sounded like they weren't crazy about how frequently it was happening. I think early on in the season, they can stomach it and they understand we're trying different things. We have to see what works best. But last year, it felt like the entire season, they were constantly being changed. And I felt like there was never a chance given to really develop chemistry in some of those situations. Lafreniere is a perfect example. For short little stints, they would try him at right wing, but they never really gave him a long runway to go through the growing pains and sort of figure it out. And I think Laviolette seems more determined to do that. He said today that when it comes to the 5-on-5 lines and also when it comes to the power play, that right now he's looking at a lot of different things. But by the time we get to next week, when the Rangers have those final 2 preseason games next week on Wednesday and Thursday, he said that's going to look a lot more like what he's thinking he's going to want going into the regular season. So I think that what you see coming out of camp and at the end of camp will probably be what we see to start the regular season. And he'll try to give those lines a runway. But of course, injuries happen, underperformance happens. There's all kinds of different factors that could lead to changes. The one thing I would say is that I think the players would all benefit from, and probably if you ask them to answer you honestly, enjoy, is if they didn't change quite as much as they did last season.
Gotcha. And you mentioned some of the younger guys. The one guy that really kind of made a name for himself on Tuesday was Matt Rempe. Just do you feel he's got some sort of role with this team, or is this just him battling in the preseason?
He's not going to make the NHL team. He's going to play for Hartford this season for sure. He's a long shot guy. Now, we do this big project every summer where we rank the top 10 prospects in the organization. I poll all different kinds of scouts and executives and people who have opinions on these sorts of things to put that list together. And Remby's certainly not a guy that got any consideration for the top 10. He's a guy that if he carves at any kind of a role, it's going to be a fourth line type of guy. He skates pretty well for his size. There's not a ton of skill there, but he's going to be a guy who brings toughness. You see that he's willing to fight. I think it definitely made a good impression in the locker room that when there was a situation where Ross Johnston was clearly looking to fight somebody, that of all the guys who were playing the other night, it was one of the youngest guys there in Rempe who was willing to answer the bell. And so that certainly goes a long way, not only with your teammates, but I also think the coaching staff takes notice of things like that. But as far as Rempe being a real NHL player for the Rangers this season, he's pretty far down, I think, on the list of guys who could play into that role. Eventually, could he get a look as a fourth line bruiser, as a guy who can bring size and skate a little bit and defend and play with some grit? Maybe, but there's actually a few guys in the organization like that. Adam Edstrom is another one of those guys, doesn't fight like Rempe does, but a lot of other similar characteristics. They're both like 6'7", 6'8". So the Rangers like to invest those late round draft picks in some of those bigger guys and see if they can hit on some of them. And they do like Rempe. Obviously, they have him here in camp and he's going to play for Hartford this season. But, he's certainly not a guy I would think is going to make this roster.
A guy definitely making the roster is Capo Caco, getting a goal in the preseason home opener against the Islanders Tuesday. How much of this Rangers success this year depends on him taking a step forward offensively?
Well, you could say that for all three of the young forwards that we talk about all the time, Caco, Lafreniere, and Hedel. Caco, to me, is a really interesting piece because it looks like they're going to play Lafreniere on that top line. I thought going into the season, especially when you look at some of the analytics from last year, the line that graded out in a lot of categories as the Rangers' best line last season was when Caco was playing right wing alongside Kreider and Zibanejad. I thought that might be his role going into the season, but it looks like Laviolette sees it differently. And the thing that I'm noticing more and more with Caco is they're starting to give him a lot more responsibility in defensive situations. That's an area where his rookie season, he really struggled. But the last two seasons, he's graded out as one of the Rangers' better defensive forwards. And Laviolette has said, I asked him this question last week, about building whatever you want to call it, a checking line, a matchup line, a defensive-oriented line. Laviolette wants to do that. He's certainly going to use that fourth line if it's Gaudreau, Bonino, and Pitlick in that way. But I also think he wants that quote-unquote third line to be able to play that role as well. You've seen Vincent Trocheck playing there quite a bit, and I think they're really going to value him taking important defensive zone faceoffs because he was over 56% last year, by far the best on the team. And who are you going to surround him with? Well, they've had Caco in that spot a handful of times so far in this preseason. So Caco might be playing a little bit of a different role than what we envisioned when he was drafted number 2 overall in 2019. But with all that being said, the reason he was drafted where he was drafted is because of the offensive upside. And Laviolette was raving the other day about Caco's unique ability to hold the puck down low in difficult situations where you're being swarmed by defenders, where people are doing everything they can to make you turn over that puck. And he's able to do that, weave through traffic. He's big and strong. People don't give him enough credit for that. And then make some creative plays, make some good passes out of those situations. Today, actually, in the power play work, he was being used in the net front role, which I don't recall seeing him used in the past. And they had him working behind the net a lot. Again, they see him as a guy who can fight through traffic and make some plays. So I think his role might be evolving. I definitely think you should expect an increase in points from him. I thought he played better than his points would indicate last season, quite frankly. Hedel got a lot of the pub because, he had that breakout with over 20 goals. But Caco, to me, was almost or just as consistent throughout the course of the season. And so I definitely see him taking a step forward. But again, I think that role is evolving and they're starting to put a little more on his plate in all situations, which also includes PK, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as a Mets, and I know you're a Jets fan as well, as a Mets and Jets fan, have become very sensitive to preseason and early season injuries. Obviously, Zibanejad will be playing tonight. Do you have any update on Panarin or Hedel?
Yeah, so Zibanejad's all good. I talked to him today. He said it was just precautionary and he's fine. Panarin, it seems the same way. I didn't get a chance to talk to him, but he skated as a full participant in practice. He didn't have that red no contact jersey on. He was a full go today. So seeing him come back after only one day off during training camp should tell you that he's fine. Hedel is the one where I guess there's a little bit more concern, but even with that, it does not sound super serious. Laviolette said today they're going to give him a few days off. It doesn't sound like he'll be back at practice tomorrow or maybe for the next few days, Laviolette said. But he also made it sound like that's more just precautionary because they're in training camp. They want to play it very safe, which I think is the smart move in this situation. And it sounds like they do expect him to be back. And there is a chance that he'll appear at least in one of those final preseason games next week. So it does not sound serious with him. I think Hedel is probably the most severe of those three, but with Zibanejad and Panarin, I think they were just very minor nicks, bruises, things like that. With Hedel, they're going to play it a little bit safer and give him a little bit more time off, but it certainly doesn't sound long term.
Well, as we get closer to the regular season start, just who has impressed you the most come camp and through the first two preseason games so far?
That's a tough question. Obviously the guys that are going to stand out are the star level players. Like I think Adam Fox has looked awesome. I think Keandre Miller has looked awesome. I think Igor Shesterkin to me has looked sharp in camp. And I think the mental fortitude that I'm sensing from him is so much improved from what we saw from him last year. He was really, I think, not in a great place for a lot of the season, just in dealing with him in the locker room, very distant, didn't want to do many interviews, but also I didn't see him really interacting with his teammates very much. He was very frustrated at times, I think, and it was evident on the ice. You'd see him in a practice setting slamming his stick on the crossbar or just reacting very harshly to giving up a goal or a play that he didn't like. And it just seemed like he was really beating himself up, being too hard on himself. And this camp, the vibes around him have been much different. And he was open about it. I give him credit because last year, I think he didn't really want to talk about it. But this year, when we got a chance to sit down with him earlier on in camp, he spoke a lot about the lessons that he learned last year and realizing that you can't let yourself get that frustrated. Of course, he's driven to be great. I think one of the most driven players on this team. And that's going to mean that you're going to be hard on yourself and you're going to demand a lot out of yourself. But you can't take it home with you all the time. You can't let it linger or, if you sleep on it and show up at the rink the next day and you're still pissed off, that's not necessarily going to be a recipe for success. So I think he's just maturing in a way where now he's realizing like, okay, I have to be able to turn the page in certain situations in order to make sure that I'm focused in the right way for the task at hand the following day. And so if Igor can be the Igor that we saw 2 seasons ago or anything close to it, which I think we saw at the end of the season last year, that's obviously, I think, probably the best sign that you could see for the Rangers. So obviously I'm naming some pretty obvious guys here. I think among the young guys, I talked about it a little bit, Cooley is really making a good impression at this camp. And I think unlikely to make the team because they're not going to keep him as a 13th forward. And I think the other 12 spots are pretty much locked in as far as who's going to be in the lineup. But in the event of an injury or the event that they need to plug someone into that top 12 who's going to actually be in the lineup every night, I think he's positioning himself as the next guy in line. And I even saw Laviolette with him during practice today, joking. Like you could tell that there's some good vibes going on between those two right now. So Cooley is a guy who's made a good impression on me. A little more under the radar, but Mac Hollowell, a right-handed defenseman the Rangers signed for depth purposes. Another guy who's not going to make this roster unless something unforeseen happens out of camp. But I do think as a depth piece, he's also the next man up. If something happens to Fox or Trouba or Schneider, Hollowell's probably going to be the guy who gets the call. And Peter Laviolette has been raving about him so far in this camp. I'm sure there's other names that can come up on top of my head. Pitlick is a guy who I think got some speed to him. Big dude who can skate, got better hands and a little more skill than I anticipated. So I think that looks like it could be a nice depth signing for the Rangers and a useful fourth line piece. So he's a guy that stood out to me a little bit. Even though he's gone now, I mentioned this on my podcast yesterday, Bryce McConnell-Barker is really improving. I think clearly the number one center prospect in the organization. He's going to play in the OHL this season. He's not an option for the Rangers, still very young, but I think his progress is something to be excited about. Those are just a few of the names that pop into my head. I'm sure there's others I'm forgetting, but yeah, I mean, those fringy guys, I think, are some of the most interesting to watch at this point of the year.
If you mentioned Hollowell being the next guy up on that blue line, just what does that mean for Zach Jones's future with the Rangers?
Well, I'm talking about right side. I think Zach Jones is definitely making this roster, even though I don't think he's had an outstanding camp, if I'm being honest with you. The Rangers are not, I repeat, not going to risk placing him on waivers. That's not only my own logic. I've heard that from sources as well. So their plan, my full understanding, is that it will be to keep Jones on this roster, likely as a seventh defenseman, because I think Eric Gustafsson is clearly going to be ahead of him as far as who gets in the lineup and who plays on that bottom pair next to Braden Schneider. But Jones will be on this roster simply because same situation we saw with Vitaly Kravtsov last year. You're not going to take a valuable prospect and expose him to waivers and let any other team that wants to claim him for free. Now, is a trade a possibility? Yes, I absolutely believe that a trade is a possibility when it comes to Zach Jones, because I don't think that there's any clear path for him into the lineup unless an injury happens or Gustafsson completely falls flat. But Gustafsson has a good relationship with Laviolette, had one of his best seasons last year in Washington under Laviolette, and he was signed with the full intention of playing. So Jones is kind of the odd man out right now, but I think he's going to make the roster. And if somebody were to get injured, he'd be the first guy up. They've also worked him a little bit on the right side in this camp. So it looks like they would try him on either side. I think he's the first man up as far as the seventh defenseman goes, but I think Hollowell is next on the depth chart if you're just talking about right-handed guys.
Awesome. Well, Vince Mercogliano, thank you very much for joining Forever Blue Shirts. We appreciate the time.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.